Some people consider him an opportunist, others a visionary. Either way, it's impossible to be indifferent about Manuel Carlos Valls, born in 1962 in Barcelona, but growing up in France. At the age of 17, he got involved in politics within the movement of young socialists and became one of Michel Rocard's advisors. In 1982, after 18 months of procedure, Valls obtained French nationality. He was then 20 years old. That same year, he made his first television appearance on national channel France.
The main problem for the youth is employment. What's the point of school if it leads to unemployment?
He was parliamentary attaché, ministerial delegate, and communications and media relations chief for the Prime Minister's cabinet until 2002. It is thanks to Lionel Jospin that Manuel Valls' political career advanced. In 2001, Valls was elected mayor of Évry, a city in the southern suburbs of Paris. In 2012, Manuel Valls was appointed Minister of Interior in the François Hollande government. Two years later, he became Prime Minister. Valls left office in 2016 to run in the primaries to be the socialist candidate in the 2017 presidential election. In 2017, he announced he was leaving the Socialist Party to join the En Marche group in the National Assembly. But Manuel Valls was already looking towards Spain. Very marked by the independence crisis and for reasons related to his personal life, he decided to reconnect with his Catalan roots. In 2019, he was elected Barcelona city councillor, but he resigned 3 years later to go back to France. This time as a political columnist.
Tonight, my guest in Malard at Large on I-24 News is Manuel Valls, the former French Prime Minister. Thanks for being with us. And straight now, my first question. Mr. Prime Minister, all the events we focus upon daily make us realize that the world order issued from 1945 under US dominance has become obsolete. Are you worried? How do you view the future world order?
En effet, on n'a pas tiré suffisamment les conséquences.
Indeed, we haven't taken into account the events that have taken place since 1989, meaning a universal norm based on two blocks that originated from the Yalta Conference and that changed economic globalization, the return of nationalism, the big empires. So indeed, it did shake the world order and also the order of powers, be they economical, political, or military. So yes, we are in an unstable world, so people are worried, and the world of today is worrying when you look at it. The risk of nuclear warfare, pandemics, there's reason to be worried, but we must face the challenges.
Il y a de quoi être inquiet, mais enfin, il faut y faire face surtout.
Joe Biden, the US president, is not reliable. Neither was his predecessor, Donald Trump, who was unpredictable. Today, the US withdraw from the world affairs in the Middle East, in Europe. They leave China, and Russia fill the vacuum. Are we on the dangerous path?
Il y a à la fois un danger, mais il faut en tirer surtout des leçons. C'est un mouvement, vous le savez mieux que quiconque, les courants isolationnistes en Amérique ont toujours existé. Mais depuis...
On one hand, there is a danger, but we need to learn what we can. It's a movement. You know better than anyone else, there's always been an isolationist movement in the U.S., but for nearly 20 years now, there's been a retreat. There's a very important date, a major factor. It's when Obama decided at the very last minute not to strike the strategic posts of President Assad in Syria in 2013. He said himself at the end of 2013 that if there was any use of chemical agents against civilians, the U.S. would strike. French planes were already deployed. The French President, François Hollande, had us meet, and I was Minister of Interior at the time. It was a key moment, an important moment, and at the last second, Obama calls him, and I'll never forget the face of President François Hollande, who realized in that moment that we won't be striking the strategic sites of Assad. A few days prior, the Chamber of Commons, the British Parliament, did not give Prime Minister David Cameron permission to participate in this operation, and this looked more like a sign of weakness, and the Chinese, and especially Vladimir Putin, took advantage of it, in Syria and also in Ukraine. But for Europe, this was a very particular moment. So yes, the U.S. is essentially more focused on Asia. Its biggest preoccupation is a confrontation with China, for now in the 21st century.
Vers l'Asie. Sa grande préoccupation, c'est la confrontation avec la Chine au cours du XXIe siècle.
Russian President Vladimir Putin wants to impose his dictate over Ukraine and encourages bloody repression versus a popular upheaval in Kazakhstan. Can the US, Europe, the Western world still find a modus vivendi with Vladimir Putin?
Avec Vladimir Poutine, je l'ai un peu rencontré.
I met Vladimir Putin a few times, not as much as a president naturally, but I'm convinced that it's the power dynamics that count with him. If there's a slight sign of weakness, he takes advantage of it. The Europeans did pretty well when it came to the issue of migrants on the Belarusian-Polish border. Probably Russia was behind Belarus supporting it. The Europeans had to stand ground and be firm. It was also in Russia's interest not to take part in this confrontation. So the firmness on a diplomatic front, economic front, and energetic front, especially when it comes to gas. So in this case, Europe needs an absolute coordination between France and Germany.
Une cohérence absolue du couple franco-allemand.
Is the Franco-German axis still alive?
Je pense que parfois nos intérêts ont divergé. Il y a une grande crainte en Allemagne. Moi, je pense qu'il y a un événement historique grave.
I think that sometimes our interests have diverged. I think an event that will weigh heavily is the departure of Great Britain from the European Union. Let's make it simple. If we're not able to share our common borders in the face of waves of migration, then we're not capable of protecting our strategic common interests. We do it in a certain number of areas, economically in particular. European defense is complicated because not many people have an army ready to fight or die for our interests.
Défendre nos intérêts. Alors là, évidemment, l'Europe rentrerait dans quelque chose qui s'appelle une forme de
In that case, Europe enters into a kind of decadence. I think there's no other way but for France and Germany and the big Mediterranean countries, like Italy and Spain, and also hoping that Poland comes back. And there's no choice but to move forward together for the protection of our strategic interests.
Pour une définition, une protection de nos intérêts stratégiques, et donc ça passe par la défense.
Mr. Prime Minister, most nuclear experts are convinced that Iran will get its nuclear bomb sooner than later. When we observe the Iranian attitude trying to gain time in the negotiations while accelerating its nuclear program, don't you think that the USA, France, and other European partners have been too naive, too gullible, while thinking they could negotiate with a terrorist regime which wants to erase Israel from the map?
Quel est notre allié, à la fois à travers les valeurs et la défense de nos intérêts stratégiques? C'est Israël. Je trouve d'ailleurs, nous l'évoquons, que l'Europe...
Who is the ally? In its values and in defending our strategic interests. It's Israel. I find that Europe, in fact, has been very shy about acknowledging the historical Abraham Accords. One of the few positive outcomes of Trump's diplomacy, by the way. The diplomatic renewal between Israel and Morocco changes the entire political landscape in the Maghreb, and not without its consequences, more particularly with Algeria, which could concern France more. So here, naturally, we must avoid any confrontation. Iran must engage itself, but let's not be naive. This kind of regime can only live in this confrontation, and I'm always surprised at politicians that can forget the lessons learned from history, the speeches, the text, anti-Semitism, this notion that Israel must be erased from the map. We must be extremely vigilant and firm, and I must point out that Biden's rhetoric isn't in campaign mode anymore.
Rayer Israël de la carte du monde, ça veut dire quelque chose. Donc là, nous devons être extrêmement attentifs, extrêmement fermes. Et je remarque que d'ailleurs l'administration Biden hésite et n'est plus sur...
We must not be naive, and if there's an agreement on behalf of the Iranians, we must be able to see that they have in fact abandoned nuclear ambitions. That being said, I'm not very optimistic about the loyalty of the Iranian regime.
Mais de faire la démonstration qu'ils ont abandonné cette voie, en disant ça, je n'ai pas beaucoup d'espoir de la loyauté de la part du régime iranien.
Now a short break. We will be back in a minute in Malard at Large on I-24 News.
Let's get Welcome to the I-24 News Desk.
Now more details on a developing story.
Breaking news at this hour.
It is history in the making.
When news breaks in the Middle East and around the world, our team of experienced journalists are here, around the clock.
To keep you up to date with the news of the day.
Where it happens, when it happens.
Stay tuned and stay informed.
Every day on the hour.
The heart of the new Middle East beats on I-24 News.
We are back in Malard at Large with Manuel Valls, the former French Prime Minister. According to you, the Iranian nuclear bomb is a real threat for the existence of Israel, or does Iran want to use it as a kind of life insurance for the political survival of its Islamic regime, as Kim Jong-un is doing in North Korea?
Excellente comparaison, vous avez raison. Mais il joue sur les deux tableaux. Ni vous ni moi, en revanche...
Neither you nor I can say that one day, maybe a cornered regime back to the wall wouldn't use nuclear weapons, be it tactical or strategic, to try and save itself. We know there's a permanent tension also in the world of cyberspace, by the way, but we never can really know, so we must be careful.
Une tension permanente, et notamment dans le monde du cyberespace. Mais on ne sait jamais, donc faisons très attention, parce que ça, malheureusement, ne sera qu'après qu'un dirigeant, un régime... Alors,
There are parameters in Iran that are different from those in North Korea. In Iran, the use of the nuclear weapon is a means of power, a means to unify its country, which we know is a nationalistic population.
D'abord pour garder le pouvoir, pour mobiliser leur peuple, qui est un peuple fier, nationaliste et patriote, mais on est sur la corde raide.
According to you, Mr. Prime Minister, will one day peace prevail between Israelis and Palestinians? Right now, there is no political will and courage on either side. Is the two-state solution the only solution?
Je pense que le vieux langage diplomatique, français ou européen,
I think that the old diplomatic language, French or European, two states in this case with Jerusalem as the capital, allows Israelis to live in security and Palestinians to have their own sovereignty. All of this is a language that doesn't work anymore. The Palestinian issue is not a priority anymore in the global agenda. The Abraham Accords have demonstrated that in a way. Now, we need to reinvent something, and in this case, the direct work and dialogue must be between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, I'm interested in what the Israeli foreign minister has to say, for example, on security, the pandemic, but most of all, at some point, we need to move on.
Il doit se faire au niveau des Palestiniens et des Israéliens. Moi, j'écoute avec intérêt ce que dit par exemple le ministre des Affaires étrangères israélien, sur la nécessité d'un début de dialogue, notamment sur les questions sécuritaires. C'était vrai aussi sur la pandémie, et sur le fait qu'il faudra...
And a lot of it depends on the situation of the Palestinian Authority. I think it's in the interest of Israel to move forward on political situations that are complicated nonetheless, but which allow the Palestinians to situate themselves. And there will need to be courage, since we know that security issues won't be delegated to the Palestinian Authority.
Aux Palestiniens de se retrouver. Et il faudra, vous avez raison, du courage pour arriver au fond à une solution qui sera un État, qui sera un proto-État, parce qu'on sait bien que les questions sécuritaires ne seront jamais déléguées à l'autorité.
The recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is undeniable, and as French people, we need to play our part. I've always said I was favorable for this recognition on behalf of the French and Europeans.
Devons jouer notre rôle. C'est pour ça que j'ai toujours dit que j'étais favorable à cette reconnaissance de Jérusalem comme capitale d'Israël de la part des Français et des Européens.
Yes, but as long as Hamas exists and denies the authority of Abbas, is there any possibility of a dialogue?
Les pays du Golfe, et plus particulièrement le Qatar, ont une responsabilité très direct par rapport.
The Gulf countries and Qatar have a direct responsibility towards Hamas on top of the Palestinian diaspora, which lives in these Gulf countries. So it will be long and difficult.
Les territoires plutôt gérés aujourd'hui par l'autorité palestinienne, c'est-à-dire par l'OLP et le Fatah, mais avec une population qui, parce que les conditions de vie se sont endurcies, parce qu'il y a une crise de confiance.
I think we'll need a lot of firmness. The security issue in Hamas's position makes the vision, or at least the possibility of advancing, very difficult.
Et cette question sécuritaire et la position du Hamas rend évidemment très difficile, nous le disions, ce courage, en tout cas cette possibilité d'avancer.
As long as this matter is not solved, is there, according to you, a risk of conflagration at a larger scale with Iran and its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad?
Un grand embrasement, je ne sais pas. Je pense que d'abord on assistera toujours à des coups durs, à des tensions, à cette guerre des missiles qui s'abattent.
I'm not sure about a big confrontation. I think first of all we'll always see tensions and escalations here and there, and this war of missiles that we see in Israeli cities as well as lone wolf attacks, and all of that is terrorism. But evidently in the same vein of what we were saying about Iran earlier, it's the question of Hezbollah. Here, too, we must be very vigilant about what's going on in Lebanon and pay attention to the fact that this organization, that is at once political and military, also has a terrorist nature.
Une organisation qui est à la fois politique et militaire, avec une organisation à caractère terroriste dont chacun mesure la dimension. Et je pense que
I don't know if it's full on, but there is potential for confrontation, particularly with Hezbollah, that has been rebuilding itself after attacks in Syria, since they were in front lines, and also by Israel, who make sure to remind them that there's a red line that cannot be crossed.
Qui veille à chaque fois à rappeler qu'il y a une ligne rouge qui ne peut pas être franchie par le Hezbollah.
China, which has recently signed with Iran a military economic pact on a 25 years period, Russia, which is the ally of Iran and Syria, are they a threat for the Western camp?
Je pense que la Chine est aujourd'hui à la fois dans une volonté de protection, de conforter les routes de la soie, et
I think China is trying to protect itself. Look at what China's done with Afghanistan. It's recognizing the Taliban. The condition is, you let us exploit your factories, and two, we want none of your support for the Muslim groups like the Uyghurs in China. It's completely pragmatic. No consideration for Islamism, for values, even for women's rights.
Aux organisations islamistes, aux Ouïghours en Chine. Donc c'est d'un pragmatisme absolu, d'un cynisme total. On n'y met aucune.
Today, they're linked with Iran in a way that's only useful to them.
Et donc, je pense qu'ils sont plutôt aujourd'hui compris dans l'Iran, avec l'Iran, dans cette volonté de conforter leur espace.
Through the progressive withdrawal of the Barkhane operation in Sahel, announced recently, is not there an increased risk of terrorist threat in the whole Sahel region, the Maghreb, and Europe from the Islamic State and ACMI, Al-Qaïda in the Islamic Maghreb?
Bien sûr, si en 2013 le président de la République François Hollande a décidé d'envoyer nos armées, c'était pour sauver le Mali.
Of course. If in 2013 President Hollande sent our military, it was to save Mali, which wasn't only at risk of being destabilized, but of falling prey to the hands of terrorists. The threat is there, and this is why the Europeans need to be at the side of the French. It's very difficult. But now we've reached a new phase, which is the destabilization of these countries. I understand perfectly the reasons for letting go of former Malian President Boubacar Keïta.
Les raisons qui ont amené à lâcher, entre guillemets, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, le président qui avait été élu. Enfin, moi je trouve qu'on a laissé faire un peu les choses. 2 coups d'État, et aujourd'hui les Russes, à travers Wagner, c'était une milice.
I think we've let things go a little too much. 2 coups, and today the Russians, through Wagner, a militia. True mercenaries with the Russians behind them. Let's not be fooled. This is worrying because here we see that we're losing something. And what worries me is that in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and maybe less in Niger, there's a whole rhetoric in the media and in social platforms against France on our most recent role in the region.
Sur les médias, sur les réseaux sociaux, dans les populations, contre la France, oubliant quel a été notre rôle, non pas il y a un siècle, mais là, récemment, il y a moins d'une dizaine d'années. Donc il faut qu'on y soit attentif. Je pense que
So we need to be attentive, but dropping it all and leaving it would probably be a strategic mistake given the terrorist threat.
Totalement laisser cela me paraîtrait une faute, c'est pas ce qui est prévu d'ailleurs, stratégique, tellement nous sommes concernés directement par cette menace terroriste.
When you were Prime Minister, you have been among the very few politicians to tackle openly and courageously the danger, the threat of political Islam. Would you say today that France and Europe are threatened by the rise of radical Islam?
Oui, et à différents niveaux. D'abord, il y a avec la défaite de Daesh, de l'État islamique, à la fin.
Yes, and on different levels. With the defeat of ISIS and the end of what they called the caliphate, there's reorganization of these terrorist groups and their objectives. In a book by Hugo Micharon, who explains that the long term is back and the goal of all these groups, this nebulous form of Al-Qaeda to Islamic State, is Europe. Their goal is to reach the Muslim communities in Europe because Europe is a strategic element for them to break and divide for a confrontation on European territory. Also, through those are being radicalized in jails and in prisons right now. There is indeed the threat from the outside, and there's the threat from the inside. And so the battle against political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafists, political and financial ties with external sources. There's also the battle on social media platforms, and also we need to help the French and European Muslim community make sure we don't confuse it with political Islam.
Combattre l'islam politique, les frères musulmans, les salafistes, les liens politiques et financiers avec l'étranger. C'est le cas notamment à travers les frères musulmans. De mener une bataille sur les réseaux sociaux, de bien aider les musulmans français. Donc,
though there is a debate within Islam itself, which is not just European but also global, we can see there is a societal issue, a civilizational issue, and it's major. It's going to be played out, of course, in the Middle East, or places like Indonesia, in Africa, in the Maghreb, and here we have strong allies like Morocco who have been standing their ground on the issue. But it's going to depend a lot on Europe, because this is where the biggest weaknesses are.
Là aussi, nous avons des alliés comme le Maroc qu'il faut tenir bon là-dessus, mais ça va se jouer beaucoup en Europe parce que c'est là où il y a les plus grandes faiblesses possibles.
When we are combing the world news, don't you have the feeling we have in front of us all the ingredients of a third world war? This is my optimistic vision.
C'est ça votre optimisme. Quand vous êtes pessimiste, je ne sais pas ce que vous nous promettez.
This is your optimism? If so, I don't want to know what your pessimism is. Maybe a Hollywood movie-type meteor hitting Earth.
Hollywoodien, pardon, nous le promet. Je pense que les formes de conflit seront différentes, mais on n'est évidemment jamais à l'abri d'une attaque.
I think the form of conflicts are different, but I think we're never safe from a terrorist nuclear attack or from the actions of a rogue state. I think the superpowers still have the capability of self-control. I'm speaking of the nuclear powers. We're never safe. For example, from the immense tension between Pakistan and India, in which India has an immense religious power, where a confrontation between Hinduism and Islam seems extremely dangerous. The rhetoric of Prime Minister Modi, it's also worrying sometimes. So there are the ingredients of a succession of crises, economic, pandemic, climatic, and terrorist, which need to bring us to a dialogue.
Terroriste qui évidemment doit nous amener à utiliser le dialogue, mais aussi à ce que nos intérêts de puissance, la France, mais l'Europe, dans la mesure du possible.
We need to choose our allies. So North America goes without saying, Israel, Morocco, and each time define our strategies. And France has a role to play because in the dialogue with China or Russia, there's always something to say, but without naivete.
Son mot à dire, mais sans naïveté.
Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Manuel Valls, many thanks for having participated to our show, talking especially on international affairs and international politics, which is a premiere for us. Thank you so much and have a great time.